Seems to be a bit slow in loading. If I think we're live. Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to revisit something I've touched on a few times. That's the decline of the British Empire, and I don't know how many lessons are in this decline that we can look at today with, say, the decline of the American empire. There are parallels, obviously, but I don't know how many and whether there's enough to really draw lessons from one and apply them to the other. I think there are some, but how many, that's up for debate. Now, recently I've been reading a lot of the correspondence between the heavyweight British politicians of the day in, say, 1895 to 1905. Now, this was around the time when the British Empire and British power was probably at its zenith, or seemed to be. Very impressive. When the British fleet showed off the latest technology of the fleet at Spithead in 1897, I think it was, pretty much the whole world turned up to sort of in awe of just how many ships the British had and how they could put a fleet in pretty much every ocean in the world. It was impressive stuff. Now, this was Britain had a population of the entire British Isles had a population of less than 40 million at the time, compared to Germany and the United States, as an example. They had close on double that population. So out of this relatively small population, they were able to administer a large empire. Again, have cutting edge technology. Fleets all around the world, everywhere you look, and nobody in the day, no country would dare do anything that they hadn't run it past the British government first to at least get an approval, or no, we won't interfere with that. You go ahead, and so this is the power that the British had. It was awesome, and it was awe-inspiring in many ways. So, but the seeds for the British Empire's destruction, I will allege, were actually being put in place during this time, the 1890s and early 1900s. Now, there was a huge debate going on at the time, which is largely ignored now, and I didn't realise the extent of it. Pretty much every leading politician of the time was getting involved, making public speeches at town halls, making speeches in Parliament, writing articles for the newspapers. It was a heated debate, and the debate was effectively this: should the British use some form of protection, tariffs, quotas, whatever, to limit imports to Britain, and some of it in retaliation for other countries putting import restrictions on British goods, or should they continue down the path of free trade? Now, talking free trade's all very good when you've got the best made, lowest price goods. So you've got, on a relative basis, high quality and lowest price. And in the early, even in the early 1800s, British goods across Europe were renowned for being better made than any other stuff, and were available at a better price. So they were able to sell their goods all over the world. Now, some of the reason that they had an edge was they had a large empire, and they developed a vast raw materials base of say in Australia and New Zealand, the wool trade, and when refrigeration started to become a thing, they could access Australian beef and things like that. But their raw materials in mines, gold, iron ore, every imaginable ore was being brought into Britain, the big workshop, the big factory, to be produced into finished goods. So they're buying these goods at very good prices compared to what other people were around town or around the world were paying. So this gave the British an edge in price, and of course the quality that they pioneered and spearheaded in the Industrial Revolution. Now, all that was changing, though. The world was changing following the Civil War in the United States. The Americans were industrialising quite quickly. Not only industrialising, but railroads were crisscrossing the country. Navigation on the Great Lakes was really ramping up, and canals were being dug, and so on. So transport was becoming a big thing. Now there were vast wheat fields in in the United States, where they had massive economies of scale, very arable land, good quality wheat, and when the railway started to penetrate the United States, a lot of it paid for, by the way, by British investors. Then they could bring the grain, they could harvest the grain, put it on the railways, bring it to the ports on the east coast of the United States that had good storage and good port facilities. Again, a lot of that paid for by the British too. And then they can transport this grain over to Britain and Europe and elsewhere at a lower price than even the British can grow the grain in Britain. And bear in mind, in Britain, the farms were much smaller, hangover from the feudal days, and were much smaller and couldn't grow things like wheat and barley and so on at anywhere near the price or the efficiency that the vast American farms could. So this was this debate about tariffs. Now the Americans and the Germans too. The Americans put quite high tariff walls over their manufactured products. They couldn't compete in the late 1860s and into the 1870s, mostly into the early 1880s. They just couldn't compete with the British in terms of price and quality at the time. So the Americans and the Germans concentrated on the newer technologies coming in, things like chemicals and precision engineered steel. So they put their efforts into the newer technologies, mass production, and they used tariff walls to create high value, well priced, good quality products. Now, the British investors at the time, and London was the investment capital of the world, the British investors at the time would say, well, gee, we can't sell our goods, our finished goods, manufactured goods into Germany or the United States, who were the big economies of the day. We can't export our stuff there because of the tariff walls. So why don't we invest in American and German industry, particularly American industry, and then if we invest in that industry, we'll get good returns on our investment because their profits are protected behind tariff walls. The converse was also true. Why should we invest in British industry and British technology? There was some investment, but nowhere near the scale that it could have been. Why should we invest in British industry and British manufacturing when we can't sell our goods because of the tariff walls? We can't sell our goods into the two biggest economies in the world. So it made sense from an investment point of view, and I think people would think that way today. It made sense from an investment point of view to invest the money in American and German industry, particularly American, because you get a better return. It's all protected behind tariff walls. So the argument was in sort of 1895 to 1905, all the big names of the day, by the way, it was Winston Churchill, David Lloyd George, H.H. Asquith, all the big players of the time. And some of these were, it was sort of aristocratic heavy, but there are a lot of industrial people in Parliament then, Joseph Chamberlain and so on. So people who were very committed to doing the best for Britain. They wanted Britain to be powerful and they wanted Britain to be successful and preeminent. So they're not like the folks today who are all owned and controlled by the globalists. This is quite different. Now, whether or not they were well informed, we can debate that point, but they were very committed to trying to do what was best for Britain. Now, the arguments raged back and forth, but the argument for staying with free trade, which had done Britain very well, but only because they had the Industrial Revolution gave them the best made goods at the best price. So they'd done very well out of that, and they'd also done very well out of services such as capital raising, insurance, and shipping, and that sort of stuff. In trade parlance and language, that's called trade invisibles, because it's not physical goods, but these services. So what the argument was, or the debate was, that if we go down the path of tariffs, then the most influential lobby groups in Britain would demand tariffs for their interests, simply to jack up their prices and become inefficient, lazy, and useless, and produce sub-quality goods, or to overprice their products, and so on. So it was seen very much from that perspective. Now, contrast this with the German and the American attitude, and particularly the Germany. The German attitude was, and I'm paraphrasing it here, is, we, the government, will give you manufacturers protection, but you must produce very high quality goods, and it must be at a price you can export around the globe. So you must use this protection to do an excellent, top-notch job. You can't use it to be inefficient, fat, and lazy. You must use this as a temporary advantage or a temporary protection from competition while you build up a world-class, first-class, top-quality industry. Now the Germans went to that with gusto, and as we all know, it's in fact even today, German machine tools and finished engineered goods are still the best in the world, and that goes back to those days when that kicked off. And again, they were very prominent in the newer industries, and massive investments were made in things like mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, chemical engineering, and so on. Now, the British, by contrast, didn't go. They went down that path, but it was quite a feeble effort in comparison. So the view was that if we go down the protectionist path, then it'll simply mean an inefficient sector will be created, and inefficient industrial practices, and if then manufacturers or producers will overprice their goods because they don't need to be competitive anymore. And when that happens, workers' standard of living will decline, and they in turn will demand pay rises, and so it'll actually put Britain in a worse position. But not that I can find anyway. Not one of these speeches, by again, leading lights of the time, Winston Churchill and so on. Not one of these speeches, utterances, or columns in newspapers did they say, why don't we use these put protections in place to create world-class competitive industries? I can't find any discussion along those lines. So the debate was either we have protection and have fat, lazy, useless, incompetent business, or we don't have protection and we have competitive industries through competition. Now, that was an absurd assertion, because America and Germany were again hiding behind large tariff walls. They were using them to good effect. They weren't using them to be lazy or useless or anything. They were using them to good effect. But if you've got your main competitors, and indeed your main markets, United States was a big market for Britain back then, still is now. And if you've got that sort of market size there, and you can't sell a lot of your goods into there, your finished goods, and you're a manufacturing economy, which Britain was, then you need to really look at that and say, well, maybe we need tariffs as well, even in response to that. Now, the main imports into Britain at the time, and even going back earlier than that, were things like grain. So American grain. So one of the speeches, in fact, a number of speeches, again, a Churchill speech, I dug up on this one, was to say, well, we have put tariffs on American grain, which he wouldn't do anyway, so I don't know why Churchill used that stupid example, but if you put tariffs on grain, so that local people can only buy British grown grain, which is much less competitive, smaller farms, that sort of thing. So if we do that, then the price of bread's going to increase. That means the poor and the working class people are going to have their budgets squeezed, and the local farmers will overprice their goods to squeeze the poor people even further. Why would anybody want that? We have to say no to tariffs, because that'll be the effect. Now, obviously, you wouldn't do it on something like grain, and you would only use tariffs to protect your own industries that you want to either make competitive, manufactured goods I'm talking here, or to be more competitive, or to give them a breathing space while they become competitive, particularly in newer industries and so on. Now, what this meant over the time, the free traders won out in the end. And I see this as the seeds for the destruction of the British Empire, because there was no protection for local industries. The bigger investors of the day were investing in Germany and the United States, or South America, or wherever. They weren't investing in Britain. So if you look at sort of the latest technology in steel production and sheet metal and lathes and machine tools and all this. The Germans were producing the latest and the greatest, as indeed the Americans were, where the British were still using quite old stock, or old machinery, old plant and equipment. And they were falling behind by almost an entire generation. Sure, there were pockets of innovation, but really the investors think, why should we invest in Britain? Um, we make more money investing in the United States because they've got the tariff protection. And that's what happened. So investment didn't occur in Britain. So the British fell behind by an entire generation in plant and equipment. And the German, as an example, the German machine tools and their factories and particularly where it was very fine precision engineered goods, the Germans were a full generation ahead by even the early 1900s. And particularly by, say, 1909, 1910, the Germans maybe were almost a generation and a half in front, and also well standardised, whereas the British were still using a cottage industry concept where the factory down the road would produce something that was a slightly different size, maybe only by a few microns, but a slightly different size, a few mils, than the other factory, so that the parts weren't interchangeable, things like that. Really sloppy sort of stuff. Now, the Americans were also moving down the path of mass production, large factories where you could specialise in every facet of the manufactured goods. Even looking at Henry Ford, where his concept of raw materials coming in down, the back end of the factory and at the front end, the cars are coming. This sort of thing, which for its time, I mean, they specialised further as time went on, but for its time, that was an area of great specialisation, and but it had to be on a certain scale before it was worth doing. And the production line, this sort of thing, these were innovations that required a certain amount of scale to achieve. So this is where the British started to fall behind investment. They weren't investing locally; they were investing internationally, which were giving just the investment class, the rich investment class, giving them a good return, but wasn't benefiting the country. So that once the trade in the flows of trade around the world changed, Britain found itself, hey, hold on a minute. We can't compete anywhere anymore. We don't have the best quality goods. We don't have the best price goods. We don't have the most advanced technology. We're quite low on the innovation scale compared to our major competitors, and our investment capital is all going offshore, not locally. And this was the beginning of the end for Britain. And so you're looking really, technologically, their apex was probably 1909, 1908, 1909. It was pretty much downhill from there. Sure, pockets of innovation, but in reality, across the board, they were already screwed at that point. So all they needed was a couple of decent shocks, one or two decent shocks, and they were gone, which World War One and Two provided. So when we're looking at decline of empires, there's sort of a lot of imperceptible forces. And no one realised in 1895, 1900, when this debate was raging in Britain about protectionism, no one realised the implications of this debate. They thought it was something that was, we're doing fine, thanks. This is just an exercise in fine tuning. This is not a major big deal. This has no big strategic consequences. Some of the newspapers did say, hey, the consequences could be dire if we don't do this. But the general political discourse was, no, this is a matter of minor fine tuning, and if we find that we're wrong, tomorrow or the next day, we can easily change course. But it didn't end up like that. That was pretty much the end of the protectionist argument. Certainly at that time, not that it didn't come up again, at other times, but that was the first or the last time it was discussed in the modern era. At that time, and they made a mistake, in my view. Had they put the protections, the tariffs and the quotas in place, but also they had to do you're only getting this protection to create world quality, world class, competitive goods. Otherwise, you don't get protection, and that's still the case with protection today. It would still work today if that were done. But most governments simply use it to protect local industries and then create artificial waste with added employment of people who aren't needed and so on. You've been Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.